Hello, folks. It's time for our hybrid day for October 23rd. Wanted to finish out on political parties and then talk about elections. And really, in elections, I only really want to talk about the Electoral College. So that's what we're going to do today. I will start off with a quick reminder. We talked about why America has a two-party system the other day, and the basic idea was there were three characteristics about the American political party system, or the American elections that guaranteed a two-party system. They were narrow political culture, single-member districts, and plurality elections. The basic idea here was you got to fight for the middle. Our two major parties fight for the middle. We went through two election cycles, one where the Republicans split, and because of that, a Democrat won, even though more people voted for the conservative, right, 58% to 42%. But the the Democrat won because the Republican side split. Since conservatives are not stupid, they learned from that and they don't split their vote, at least for a generation. In 2000, it was on the Democratic side. The split was much smaller this time, but the Gore v. Bush contest was super, super close. So even that 2% of of hardcore liberals that went for Nader took away what should have been, had the liberals held their political house together, a fairly clear Gore victory. But it didn't work out that way because the liberals in this case, the way far liberals, the Green Party folks, followed Nader, some of them, and that gave the election to Bush. Hence, the liberals learned the same thing. If you split your vote, you will lose. We never get more than one major party on either side of the spectrum, and the Republicans and Democrats always fight over the middle. That's the magic of the system. Now, there are good things about a two-party system. It keeps for stable governments, gives voters clear choices. Our elections are simple. They're not super complicated. You're picking between Republicans and Democrats, or metaphorically between chocolate and vanilla. You don't have to pick from 30 different categories. Now, there are problems with that. There are fringe groups on the side. If your heart really is green, you never have a candidate that's actually your candidate. If your heart really is libertarian, you never have a candidate that's actually your candidate. And so folks on the fringe, if we're lucky, feel a little alienated, and out of that they just sort of a pox on both your houses. I'm not voting. I hate our government. They grouse, they complain, and we're okay. It's not good, but we're okay. On the other hand, sometimes they might actually, those alienated folks might actually turn violent. The biggest episode of domestic terrorism in American history, Timothy McVeigh bombing the Edward R. Murrow building in Oklahoma City, was largely about his radical right-wing perspective and no real electoral outlet for that political perspective. Similarly, we saw left-wing political violence in the late 60s, as well as right-wing political violence. Folks on the fringe who feel like this moderate two-party system doesn't represent them, and they turn to violence. Now, this is not a justification of political violence, but it is in some ways an explanation why folks with political perspectives that do not fit in that mainstream center of the curve would feel alienated and might turn to violence. The other thing is, when we do have even earth-shattering elections, big change elections like 2008 or 2016, the folks who thought they were going to get dramatic change often find themselves disappointed 4 or 8 years later when less change than they expected was actually the result. Now, there are alternative election systems. One very common one that is used as at least part of the election process in most modern democracies is something called proportional representation. In this system, voters do not vote for a candidate at all. There are no candidate names on the ballot at all, only political parties. So the voter goes to the ballot and they pick the party of their choice. Parties create what they call a slate of electors, or a slate of candidates. If there are 100 seats up for election, they'll have their slate of 100 candidates on the completely irrational possibility that they might win all of the votes. So they're first, then they're ranked candidates. So number one is if we get only one seat, this is our person. Number two is if we get 2 seats, we get number 1 and 2, and so on down the way. So voters go to the ballots, they vote for their candidate for the party of their choice, and if you're a Green and you get 15% in a legislature with 100 seats, you would get 15 candidates. The total number of seats are distributed among the parties in proportion to the votes in the election. Now, in this scenario, you regularly have parties with 10 or 15% that seat, 10 or 15% of the electorate or of the legislature from their party. It's never going to happen that a 10% party is the majority or is able to form the government in a parliamentary system, but that 10% could be the junior partner, the ones that bring along the vote to pass the Health Care Act, or to pass the tax reform, or to pass the Environmental Act, or to pass the immigration reform, or whatever it is. And in their negotiation with the major party, they can frequently go, okay, we'll support your agenda item here in exchange for, if you're the Greens, in exchange for some environmental law that they couldn't have passed on their own. Or if you're the Libertarians, in exchange for some sort of deregulation that we couldn't have gotten through on our own. The good things about proportional representation, you get multiple political parties. People get to vote their conscience. Not have to just pick between chocolate and vanilla, but you have multiple flavors. Most democracies use some form of proportional representation. The disadvantage to it is you tend never to get a single party that's really in charge. So you're constantly fighting over coalitions. It tends to be kind of unstable. Very few, if any, democracies use proportional representation for their whole legislature. But they will use a mixed system where maybe half of the legislature is elected in single-member districts and the other half are in proportional representation. Another possibility would be the runoff election with a majority requirement, where we say instead of plurality rules, to win the seat, you must have a majority. So they run a first round with the total number of possible candidates representing all the parties. Maybe there are 6 or 7 parties. People vote based on their party. And then they do a second round election. If nobody wins a majority in the first round, they eliminate all but the top 2 and run a second round. Well, if there are only 2, just the top 2, then logically, somebody comes out with a majority. So given the choices that remain, the voters pick out of those 2 which is their favorite or their preference, and that person at least has a majority support. So you don't get the odd outcome where the 2 conservative parties split and that gives us the liberal even though there were way more conservative votes, or vice versa. You don't get that. So people can actually vote their conscience in the first round. So that would be in America, if you're a Green, you could actually vote Green in the first round without throwing the election to the Republicans. Or if you're a Libertarian or a super conservative, you could actually vote for a Ross Perot or for a Libertarian candidate without throwing the election to the liberal, like as in Bill Clinton in '92. Runoff elections. Now, the disadvantage to runoff elections is it means another cycle of elections. Voters get tired of going to the polls all the time. They get frustrated and they quit going. Also, it's costly. Each election is very expensive. And every time you run another one, it's another many millions of dollars. So we don't tend to do that in the United States because it's so expensive and adds to voter fatigue. There is another one that has the advantage of runoffs. It's called instant runoff voting, or more frequently they're using the term ranked voting. In 2016, the voters of Maine passed a proposition to amend their state constitution and institute ranked voting in their state. Now, there have been parts of local level elections in Minnesota that have been doing this for some time, but the whole state of Maine just went to this. Now, what ranked voting is, this is something new. It requires that the election be run with ballots that can be scanned into computers or done with electronic voting machines, because the ballots have to be kept track of in a computer database that can sort it. So what would happen in this scenario, instead of voters being given a ballot that says vote for one, right? You pick your favorite. Voters will be giving a ballot where the instruction is rank the candidates in order of your preference, with one being your highest preference, your favorite, and in this scenario, four candidates, four being your least favorite of the four. So a voter would mark their ballot. They would mark, 1 through 4. Our hypothetical voter here loved, Libby Libertarian, liked Richie Republican second, and then Gabby Green, and then Denny Democrat, because this particular voter hates the Democrats. So that would be the way a voter would cast that. You'd rank them in order of your preference, one being the first and so on. Then the computer would scan every ballot, keep track of each ballot as a complete unit. Your ballot number 3,221,000, whatever the serial number for that ballot was, had this ranking. It's done by serial numbers for the ballot, not voters. You don't know who cast the ballot, but the computer keeps track of the ballot. Now, in the first round, hypothetically, we would have an election where the total voter outcome was, in this scenario, Libby Libertarian gets 16, Richie Republican 28, Denny Democrat 36, and Gabby Green 20, for example. And in instant runoff voting, you have a majority requirement. Okay, did anyone get more than 50%? No, definitely not. So the computer would then go back and it would go to our ballot, because the person with the lowest votes is Libby Libertarian, right? The hypothetical ballot that we marked had Libby Libertarian number 1. And it would cross out Libby Libertarian. And then everybody who voted for Libby, that candidate was the last finisher, so that candidate's no longer eligible. Everybody that voted for Libby, the computer would go to their next choice. It would cross out Libby, and it would go to their next choice. So for our particular voter, they had Libby Libertarian first and Richie Republican second. Someone else might have had Libby first and Gabby second, or so on. Now, so for our hypothetical ballot that we just showed a little bit ago, it would have crossed out our first choice, and it would go on the second round. It would count our ballot as going to Richie Republican. Now, all of the ballots that voted for any of the 3 remaining candidates, the Republican, the Democrat, or the Green, they would still be counted, used on their number 1 vote. Ours and others that had voted Libertarian would be counted on their number 2, their second choice. So hypothetically, in the second choice, most libertarians in the U.S. tend to align themselves with the Republicans. So let's give 13 out of the 16 to the Republican. 28 was their original number, plus 13 of the Libertarians. Second choice was Republican. And maybe 3 of the Libertarians were Libertarians largely because of the personal issues, not the business issues. So they sided with the Democrat. So we ended up with a total on the second round of the Republican taking a slight lead, 41-39. Okay, does anyone have a majority yet? You guys can all tell nobody's got more than 50%. So we're going to have to do another round. Okay. The last place finisher, Gabby Green. Gabby's ballot gets eliminated, or people who are currently voting for Gabby as their first choice. And all of those folks that were where Gabby Green was their top candidate, the computer would go ahead and retally those using their second choice. Or if it happened to be, we didn't show any like that, but if they happened to have Libby first and Gabby second, then it'd go to their third choice. And hypothetically, in this scenario, the Greens would, most of them, line up with the Democrats, and the Republicans would, and maybe some of them would line up with the Republicans. And we end up here, hypothetically, 15% go to the Democrat, 5% to the Republican, and we end up with a 54-46 victory for the Democrat. Now, in this scenario, with instant runoff voting, you could totally have 4 major parties. And folks whose heart was green could vote green without risking throwing the election to the Republican. And folks whose heart was libertarian could vote libertarian without risking throwing the election to whichever the opposite side is for them, depending on the individual voter. Instant runoff voting. This is a cool system. You eliminate the problem of a minority candidate winning. By minority, I mean a person who got less votes than, for whom more people voted against them than voted for them. And you don't have the complication of another round of elections that are expensive. Now, the downside. The downside is the complicated ballot marking. As I've worked the polls over the years, when the ballot changed just slightly from a standard fill in the bubble to a draw a line that completes the arrow kind of ballot, we got nearly 10% of the voters who cast ballots in person messed up their ballots. Could not figure out how to mark the new ballot. It was really simple. And after about 4 years, almost all the voters do it, but we still have maybe 2 or 3%, or maybe even more, but some small number of voters who still mess up their ballot. Okay, who are these voters? Well, they fit into pretty standard profile. They tend to be older than me, usually quite a bit older than me, and they frequently, the ones that are still making those mistakes, also struggle with English. So what we have is you complicate the ballot, and it creates problems for voters who are a little slower in learning, largely because of age or because of a language problem. That doesn't mean they're stupid. It certainly doesn't mean we should take away their vote. But when you change the ballot, make it complicated, you cause problems for some voters, and you get a lot more ballots that get disqualified that simply cannot be counted because the voters' intentions are not clear because of their mistakes. That is a complication and a challenge that people will have to work through if we want to go that route. If we went to instant runoff voting, it is entirely possible. We could move out of the world of a 2-party system into a 3- or 4-party system. It's entirely possible. Now, instant runoff voting is something that can be done state by state. That's a matter for state election law. Maine is pioneering in this election cycle. We'll see how it turns out for them, and perhaps other states might adopt similar things. Okay, now, I'm going to kind of skip through these sorts of... Alrighty, so, hypothetical clicker question, by what elements of the typical election environment or process in the U.S. almost guarantee a 2-party political system here in the U.S., from what we just talked about, and from the other day, as reviewed it today? Is it A, collaboration among the 2 dominant parties and the mass media? B, conspiracy between the 2 dominant parties? C, lack of creativity and imagination among American voters? D, a narrow political culture, plurality election rules, and single-member districts? Or E, the U.S. Constitution mandates a 2-party system? Think about it for a second. You'd want to commit to that. And I'm not actually going to tell you the answer. You can go back and review. But I will tell you that some version of this question will, in fact, show up on your final. That's a promise. Now, moving on. A couple of things you should have picked up from your reading. In the U.S. Senate, how many senators does each state get? You can look that up. American presidents are elected by, well, how? A, by an election in the U.S. Senate. B, through a direct national election. C, through an electoral college where the votes are counted state by state. D, through an electoral college where the votes are tallied or counted nationally without regard to the states. Or E, through direct elections tallied, counted state by state. Okay, hopefully you know the answer. We're going to be talking about that. It is, in fact, an electoral college counted state by state. C. Moving on. So I want to talk about the electoral college. I used to kind of brush over the electoral college because as a political scientist, it seemed kind of easy to me. And then when I started talking with, I visited a service club. They asked me to come talk about it. And this was the 2004 election cycle, only 4 years after the really big, crazy thing that happened in Florida in 2000, which gave us 3 weeks where we didn't know who won the presidential election, waiting for court decisions to determine which count or how we're going to finish up the counting, and reviews over and over and over again on the media about how the electoral college is the reason everything comes down to Florida. And it's one county in Florida. Okay, so what I learned when I did the presentation in 2004, I thought it would be really quick on the electoral college, and it turns out a lot of these adults who had really good educations, they were professionals, some of them teachers, some of them lawyers even, and a judge. Most of them, even the lawyers, didn't really understand the electoral college. Okay, so because I want to spend some time on it. The first thing to know is on election day, you need to think of the electoral college as not one election for president, but 50 different states and the District of Columbia, 51 separate elections. In each case, they're separately voting for the president in separate elections. Then each of those elections determines who become the delegation of electors who will cast the vote for their state. Now, how many electors does each state get? That's a formula that comes right out of the Constitution. It was a compromise. They basically decided, hey, we already wrestled over whether it should be states are equal or whether states should be represented based on population, and we tried to do it both ways. So for the electoral college, let's use exactly the same formula. Each state gets the same number of electors that they have in the entire Congress, both House and Senate together. So each state gets 2 for just being a state, and they get some number based on population. For California, that number is currently 53. So we get, in California, 2 plus 53, or a total of 55. Okay, for Montana, it gets 2 for being a state, 1 because it's got a person or 2 in it. Literally has about 400,000. Not enough to qualify for a complete congressional district if it weren't its own state, but the Constitution says every state gets 1 at least. And so they get 2 plus 1 for 3, and so on. Now, here is an electoral college map. It's a little fuzzy, but it gives us the numbers. The largest delegation at present is California with 55. Texas comes in second with 38. Florida and New York are tied for third with 29 each. And then it jumps down to Pennsylvania and Illinois with 20 each, and so on down as we get smaller and smaller. Excuse me. So, each state is represented partially by population, partially by being a state. That does mean that states with small populations have their population somewhat overrepresented, because the 2 that are tied to being a state, they are spread out among only 400,000 citizens in Montana, but they're spread out over almost 40 million citizens in California, or it's about, not quite, but about 50% of voters in any given state tend to be registered voters. For Montana, that's spread out among 200,000 registered voters, or from California among, well, recently we crossed over 19 million registered voters. So, small states, states with small populations, are overrepresented. Large states with large populations are underrepresented in a relative sense. But anyway, there we have the basic distribution. Now, the particulars of this map are based on an assessment in the 2016 election cycle, before we actually went to the polls, of which direction states were likely to vote. The dark red ones were firmly Trump. The pink ones were leaning Trump, and the darker pink ones were leaning really hard. The light pink one, South Carolina, there was leaning slightly. The dark blue are absolutely firmly Democratic. The light blue were leaning Democratic. The gray ones were close enough that this particular pollster was calling them toss-ups. This pollster was really careful about calling anything. A lot of those states that it called toss-ups were really quite firm. And I don't know on what planet you would call Utah just pink, not dark red. But in any case, the same with Oregon. I don't know what planet Oregon would be light blue and not dark blue. I haven't got a clue. They're very, very liberal. But anyway, that's the basic map. Big states, small states, and so on. So that's how it's distributed. Now, on election day, each state determines its electors. Then on some day, usually some weeks later in December, a date predetermined by Congress, those electors meet in their respective Capitol buildings in their respective states. The electors never go to D.C. They go to their state capitals. Sacramento for California, Carson City for Nevada, Boise for Idaho, and so on. They never go to Washington. They cast their ballots, and then their ballots are sent, or their votes are sent by courier to Congress, where Congress opens and determines who wins. Now, when they open this up, in order to win, the candidate must win a majority of all eligible electoral college votes. If one state doesn't pitch in, that doesn't reduce the number it takes to win. If one state, for whatever reason, doesn't send its delegates, you still have to win a majority of all the potential delegates, even if that state had sent them. Now, there is no second chance balloting. If nobody has a majority, you can't go, here in I don't know, in Nevada, we're going to change our vote so there's a majority. Nope. There's no second chance. Now, the only way you get a no majority is if more than 2 candidates actually win electoral college delegates. That only happens if you have a really, really, really strong third-party candidate, or if a state or two, for some reason, fails to tally their votes and report their, and pick electors who can cast ballots for them. Now, if in fact that happens, and there's no majority, then the decision for the president goes to the House of Representatives. Normally in the House of Representatives, California has 53 votes and Montana has 1. But if the House decides the election of the presidency, the rules change. California suddenly gets only 1 vote, along with Montana. So California's 53 representatives have to poll themselves and determine which candidate they're going to cast their 1 state ballot for. And the Montana voter, the Montana elector or Congress member has to determine whom he or she is going to cast his or her ballot for. States that are tied, or that have 2, if they differ, have to figure out some way to work out their difference. There's no rule for how they do that. They just have to decide. This has actually happened more than once in American history, but not recently. Now, I want to go back to the Electoral College's process for how states determine their electors. 48 states use the standard winner-take-all distribution. They count the total votes for all the presidential candidates statewide, and the person with the plurality, doesn't have to be a majority, the plurality of votes in their state wins the entire thing. It's a winner-take-all distribution. So if you win 45% of the voters in California, and the second place winner wins 44%, and then there's a third candidate that gets some, whatever the extra 11% there, then the person with 45, the first place finisher, even if it's just a plurality, not a majority, gets the entire 55. It's a winner-take-all system. Most states do it that way. 48 states do it that way. I'm going to skip that. Now, there's another system that both Maine and Nebraska use, where they try to break it up more specifically state by state. The way they do it, they do a statewide winner, just like the 48 other states, and whoever wins the whole state by plurality gets the two electors, electoral college voters, or electoral college electors, that they assign to be the ones that represent the Senate. Then they go district by district, and there is one elector that goes to the person who won the presidential contest in each congressional district. So you count up the presidential votes congressional district by congressional district. Okay, so hypothetically, in Maine, I pick Maine because there are only 4. In Maine, in Nebraska has 5. In Maine, you get the statewide total. Hypothetically, the Republican might win 55%, Democrat 45%. Republican would get the 2 for the whole state. In District 1, this would be the rural district in northern Maine. The Republican gets 65% and the Democrat gets 35%. Okay, the Republican gets that one. And in District 2, the southern district that covers Portland and the more urban part, the more city part of Maine, the Democrat wins that one. So the Democrat gets that one electoral college vote. Maine has 4, and it could split 3-1. Maine actually did that, a 3-1 split, in the 2016 election cycle. I can't remember if it was 3-1 Republican or 3-1 Democrat. That's not so relevant here. That's more historical than theoretical. Here we're talking about the theory, or the process. Okay, so Maine does that. Now, what if a bigger state, like California, were to go with the Maine system? In 2016, now 2016's election outcome was unusual. The state had a solid Democratic victory. It was 70% to 30% in favor of Clinton. That's a little unusual. There were 7 congressional districts where the Republican candidate won the majority. Our district, the one that most of us live in, was one of those 7. Then there are 46 districts where the Democratic candidate, Clinton, won a majority in their congressional district. Okay, so the Republicans would get 7 for their 7 districts they won. The Democrats would get 46 for the 46 district they won. Plus 2, so you'd have a 7 to 48 electoral college vote outcome. Now, 7 votes difference. That's bigger than many states. There are lots of states with only 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. That's lots of states. So it's more than just that one little tiny rule change would change the outcome as much as winning a couple of small states. Kind of interesting. Now, and that was an unusual, the Democrats prototypical type of election would be the results from, say, 2004. This was This was George W. Bush's re-election for second term. The challenger was John Kerry. The outcome in California was a solid majority for the Democrat, won the state solidly. There were 17 congressional districts where George W. Bush won the majority, or the plurality at least, of votes in that district. There were 36 districts where the Democrat, John Kerry, won the plurality or majority. So the electoral outcome would be the Democrats get 2 plus 36 for 38. The Republicans get 17. Now 17. There are very few states bigger than 17 electoral college votes. Very few. The change in election rules could very likely change the outcome of many close presidential elections. And that's just in one state. Now, not surprisingly, because California, at least for the last 25 or 30 years, has been reliably Democratic, Republicans would love to change the system to win extra electoral college votes. In fact, there was a proposition that got qualified for the ballot some years back. I think it was about 2004, to change California's system. Now, interestingly, the proposition was paid for by a Republican congressman from Texas. What was he doing? Trying to change the rules to give Republicans an advantage in presidential elections. Now, the 17 to 38, that's a whole lot closer to how Californians as a whole actually voted. A lot more democracy-like. And if we did that in all 50 states, it would make our electoral college look more like, though not exactly like, but a lot more like the actual direct popular vote. However, if you change the rules in California, the biggest, most reliably Democratic state, but you don't change the rules in Texas, the biggest, most reliably Republican state, then what you're doing is changing the rules specifically to give an advantage to one party. That's not making it more democracy-like or more fair. That's trying to change the rules to cheat, to slant the playing field. And that's exactly why, when the Democratic Party started advertising that this is exactly what's going on, and made it very clear to voters that the money was all coming from Texas, and it was a Republican Congress member from Texas who was not changing the process, not trying to change the process in Texas, it became really clear that, well, voters weren't going to fall for that. So he pulled it because he wasn't willing to spend any more millions on changing California's election laws when he knew he was going to lose. Meanwhile, Colorado had a proposition to do that in that same election cycle, and the voters in Colorado is a 50-50 state. It's purple. It can go either direction in any given election. And the voters of Colorado had the option to make that change to where their electoral college votes, they have 9 delegates, or 9 electors, could go 5 and 4 if they were really close. And the voters of Colorado rejected it soundly. The idea being they preferred having the presidential candidates pay a lot of attention to Colorado, because if they move just a few thousand votes in Colorado, that can win them a whole 9 electoral college votes. Whereas if they went with a proportional or just one congressional district or congressional district by congressional district system, then a move of a few thousand in Colorado would only get them one more electoral college vote. That's not worth the effort. So Colorado stuck with its winner-take-all system because they believed it was better for Colorado to speak as one voice, which is where most states are and why we have a winner-take-all system. Now, I do want to talk about who the electors actually are. My bet is none of you have ever heard the name or been told who one of the actual electors who actually cast a vote in the Electoral College, who that person was. So, I want to talk about how they're selected. They are selected by the votes of voters in their respective states. Whoever wins the state wins the slate of delegates picked by the party of that candidate. Now, states tend to delegate the nomination of the electors to the winning party. The rules and allocation vary by state and by party within states. So the California system you can find on the California Secretary of State's webpage. Here is the rule right off the Secretary of State's webpage. It's right out of California Election Code. On or before October 1 of the presidential election year, each party's nominee must file a list containing the names, addresses, and telephone numbers of the 55 electors pledged to him or her. Each party determines its own rules or methods for selecting electors. Okay. So whichever party wins California has already given a list of 55 electors before October 1. The election happens in the first Tuesday after the first Monday of November, sometime between the 2nd and the 8th of November. And whoever wins the plurality of California gets that slate of electors gets picked. Okay, now, the rules. The two parties have different rules. The Democrats' rules look really simple. Here it is. Each congressional nominee, so there are 53 House of Representatives seats. So each of those 53 Democrats running for in each seat selects a nominee. And the two U.S. Senate nominees in the most recent Senate elections, because there are two seats, but they don't run in the same time. But whoever's the Democratic nominee in the Senate, whether they won or lost, that person selects someone. Okay, that's the system. The Democratic system seems to be a little out of date. Because of our new primary structure, there may not actually be a Democrat in some congressional districts. So that leads to some sort of awkwardness. They probably need to update their rules. The Republican rules look a lot more complicated, but they're not really. This is just a list of office holders within the Republican Party, the nominee for governor and lieutenant governor, treasurer, these statewide executive offices. Those nominees that from their party are the electors in the last two elections. Now, they've got U.S. Senate at the last two elections, which is a really kind of weird thing because if they actually won, those candidates couldn't be there. But anyway, it's their set of rules. It isn't that complicated. It just has a lot of different offices listed. But these various office holders each are the electors. So that's the process. Now, the effects of the Electoral College. The intention was to make sure that states mattered in the election. And there was this, for many of them, this very conscious intention of making sure that cities didn't totally dominate. That rural states, good farmer types, would have, as they perceived it, would have a little extra sway. And that's what it does. Now, in terms of the way it affects elections, candidates need to build state-by-state strategies. It doesn't matter what the national poll of all American voters are thinking very much. What matters is what's happening state by state. Can you put together a pile of electoral college delegates, or electors, that gets you up to 270? Now, they tend to focus on large states, but only if those large states have a voter registration and polling result that suggests that they are competitive, that either candidate might win. These would be on the map, the ones that were gray, or at least light pink or light blue. And among those toss-up states, those where they could go either way, they tend to focus on the big ones. Big ones with close election predictions. Okay, now it leads to potential odd outcomes. You can win a very narrow victory in a few relatively large states and end up winning the Electoral College with only a minority of popular votes where the other candidate got more than you. This happened. This is how Kennedy won the election of 1960. Nixon actually had more popular votes. More recently, we've had two elections in 2000 and 2016 where a person wins lots of small states but loses the big states badly and ends up with a majority of electoral college votes but less votes than the other candidate got. As in, George W. Bush got fewer votes nationally than Al Gore by about 1 million, and Donald Trump got fewer votes nationally than Hillary Clinton by about 3 million. So there are these potentially odd outcomes. Now that leads to the, well, why should I bother? Because my vote doesn't really count anyway. That's a not very convincing argument. Your vote does actually count in selecting the delegation of electors that votes for your state. That can make a huge difference. Now, it maybe doesn't feel that way when you live in a state like California where a few hundred or a few thousand votes was unlikely to make a difference. But it leads to kind of problems. Now, making sure we understand, a president under the U.S. Constitution's regular process, or to become president under the U.S. Constitution's regular process, that means without going to the House of Representatives, a candidate or person must A, get the approval of the United States Supreme Court after winning the election, B, win a majority of states, C, win a majority of votes in the Electoral College, D, win the nomination of his or her party, or E, win the plurality of votes in the national popular vote count. Go ahead and think about it for a minute. Survey says, on that last one, by the way, the answer would be they have to win the Electoral College, a majority of the Electoral College. I'd like you to, we would normally do a pair share. I'd like you to think about it. Imagine you are a campaign consultant for a presidential candidate in 2020. So given what we've just talked about with the Electoral College system, and you want to win the presidential elections, I'd like you to pick 4 states that you would advise your candidate to focus on, to visit often, campaign in, give that state extra attention. And what I would want you to do is pick 4 states and be able to explain why. Okay, what are the principles that guide your choice? Think it through. While you're watching the video, it'd be wise if you did, well, pause for a little bit. Actually, first I'm going to show you a map. Oh, I thought I was going to show you a map. So the outcomes, what actually happens and what you should be doing. You should focus on states where the expected election outcome is close. Among those close expected outcomes, that's where we think it's tied or close to tied. Then among those you would pick large states. I already talked about the potentially odd outcomes. Now, for that question, which states would you focus on? Looking at the map here, you would totally ignore the dark blue and dark red. Those states are firmly in one camp or the other. The darkish light blue, the middle blue, medium blue and medium red probably are not a good choice either. The light blue and the light pink, those might be good choices. The gray, these are the ones that are the most important in general. Okay, and then among them, you're only going to pick 4. So you would want to pick probably the 4. We don't have concrete voter data here, but the 4 that have the largest number of electoral college votes. Okay, so Florida for sure. 29. So electoral college, California first, Texas second, Florida and New York third, Pennsylvania, Florida and New York tied for 3rd and 4th, Pennsylvania at 5th. Then I think it's Ohio 6th. That's at 18. I don't think there are any at 17. And then we jump down to, well, smaller ones. Oops. I forgot about Illinois. It's also 20. But anyway, looking at the gray ones, Florida, followed by Pennsylvania, followed by Ohio. And then on this map, they're saying Georgia was a toss-up. If Georgia's really a toss-up, that'd be your next best choice. Those would be the 4 that would be based on the data you have on this map. Those would be your best choices. Now, obviously, you're going to try to campaign in more than 4 states, but those would be your top 4 priorities. Because a win in Florida might take only a few thousand voters that you convince to come out to the polls that might not have otherwise. And that wins you 29 electoral college votes. Now, you could spend your time in California, that's 55. But if you're the Democrat, you don't need to. You're already going to win. If you're the Republican, why bother? You're not going to win, no matter what. So, they tend to focus on the less firmly decided or less firmly aligned states. So here we have, just some data from the last election that shows the actual vote counts after all the official votes were tallied. All the states reported the exact numbers of their official counts. Trump wins 62,980,000 and change. Clinton wins 65,845,000 and change. We have the Libertarian. Okay, about almost 5 million. Now the Libertarian, who were they voting for? Were these fiscal conservative Libertarians? Low taxes? Well, then they might have preferred Trump, but they also might have been social libertarians who just didn't like Clinton. They were committed to personal liberty in questions of marriage and abortion and gender identity kinds of things. One doesn't know for sure with libertarians. Okay. The split was such that, who knows? And Stein with her 1.4, almost 1.5 million. So, what we get here? Odd electoral college outcomes. Far more people voted against Trump than voted for him. By about 8 million. When you add up the Democrat, the Libertarian, the Green. And the Democrat actually got more votes than he did. One candidate, by 3 million votes. But the Electoral College turned out a weird outcome. Okay, that's the Electoral College. Now, this is the most commonly proposed, getting rid of the Electoral College is the most commonly proposed amendment to the Constitution. That's what it would take, an amendment to the Constitution. But it's never made it out of Congress, and it's never likely to. Because even though it turns out odd outcomes, those outcomes work to the advantage of the political party that dominates, usually the small states. And even if it got out, so to get through the Senate, you got to convince senators from small states, which make up the majority of the Senate, to vote for something that would diminish their state's influence. Similarly, if it did get out of the Congress, you would have to have legislatures in 3/4 of the states, that it would have to include a large number of small states who would be voting to reduce the influence of their state on the presidential election. Do people very often vote to reduce their own power or influence or benefits? Not very often. And getting rid of the Electoral College would reduce the power and influence, potential benefits of the small states, which make up the largest number of states. So anyway, that's where we are. We will pick up when we come back on Thursday talking about Congress. Be sure you've done your reading, and I will see you on Thursday. Also, be sure that you'll check on the assignment that follows along with this lecture in Canvas. Thank you. We'll see you Thursday.